Hello, and welcome to my show on interpersonal communication. I'm glad you're here with me today. My name is Dr. Marquita Byrd, and I am an emeritus professor at San Jose State University. I've had the pleasure to teach for 45 years on college campuses, teaching students about how to be better communicators and improve their lives. Now I have the privilege during my retirement to extend this knowledge into the general community so that everybody can learn how to improve their lives through better communication. I'm very, very excited to talk about the topic we have today, which is interpersonal, because that is the thing that shapes our lives. Now, I have two goals for doing these shows. The first one is to help people understand the nature of interpersonal communication and relationships, because that's what we're involved in all of the time, unless we're asleep. And we're involved in interpersonal relationships. And two, to facilitate your acquisition of knowledge and skills that would allow you to improve your relationships. Ultimately, I want my viewers to live their best life, and you can live your best life if you have good interpersonal communication and relationships. My main idea today is that interpersonal communication and relationships are the very fabric of our lives. Interpersonal relationship is a living thing that can impact the quality of our lives, and therefore we must take care of those living things. Now, human beings are immersed in interpersonal relationships from the moment they are born until they step off the planet. Relationships are inevitable because guess what? We are born into a social species. The species of humanity is a species that must interact with one another in order to function productively. So we want to understand our connections with other people so that we can understand how our relationships impact those connections. It's like air, it's like water. For the fish, sometimes if the fish is not in good water, then it may not live or it may be sick. Same thing with relationships. We need to have good interpersonal relationships in order to have good physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Those are so important in our lives. So today I'm going to cover 4 points, and those points will help us to organize what we've learned today. The first point is I'm going to give you definitions of terms. I always start out with definitions not because I think the listener is stupid, but because I want us to start at the same understanding of the words. Secondly, we're going to talk about reasons that we have relationships. And third, we're going to talk about what we should look for in effective interpersonal relationships. The fourth then is a wrap-up of what we've talked about. Let's start with number 1, definitions. I'm going to define 2 terms: interpersonal communication and interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal communication has to do with interactions between 2 or more people using verbal and nonverbal communication. Now, those interactions usually are face-to-face. That's where we start. That's where we start the study of interpersonal. But they also can be written. You might not know it, but in years before we had cyberspace and telephones, people wrote letters. And so we wrote letters to each other and we wrote things. Now we also have cyberspace, so you can meet someone around the world that you may never physically meet, but can actually establish a relationship. So we have various means by which we may have interpersonal communication. Now let's go on to the second concept, and that is interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationship is an interaction among 2 or more people using verbal and nonverbal interactions across time. So you can have a conversation that is interpersonal, but when you have a pattern of conversations and behaviors across time, then that becomes a relationship. And relationship has 2 things. It has content and emotions connected with it. So the relationship has content, meaning what is it about? For example, people who are parents have an interpersonal relationship, and that relationship is about, of course, maintaining the family, taking care of the children, managing the house. That's the content. Emotions have to do with how they feel about the relationship. not about each other, but how do they feel about the relationship? Do they like it? Do they think it's helpful? Do they think it's not helpful? So we define now point one, two things: interpersonal communication and interpersonal relationships. Let's go on to point two. This is a biggie. People ask, well, why do you have to have relationships? Why do we have interpersonal communication? Once I had a roommate who knew nothing about our field, and he was a project manager, and he wanted to know, why did people doing on the project have to talk to each other face to face? Why couldn't they just get the instructions and do the project? Well, we know for a fact that projects don't go well if the people who are on the project don't talk to each other. So we need that. Even, for example, on an airplane. On an airplane, you have the pilot, you have the crew. But the pilot and the crew have to communicate with each other in order for the flight to be successful. So we always need to talk with each other. So here's 4 reasons or 5 reasons why we have interpersonal relationships. The first one is to alleviate loneliness. Loneliness is when we feel that no one knows us, no one wants to interact with us, no one wants to understand us. And we may feel that we don't understand what's going on. And so you feel lonely. Loneliness is different from being alone. Alone means that you are in a situation where you have no other human beings around you. That's being alone. You can be in a crowd and feel lonely. You can be without other human beings around you and feel okay. So being alone and loneliness are 2 different things. The second reason that we have interpersonal relationship is to increase our self-esteem. Wow, wouldn't you feel bad if you had no friends, nobody liked you, nobody wanted you, and it makes you feel like, well, wow, my worth, nobody cares about me. So we have interpersonal relationships in order to improve our self-esteem, our self-worth. And worth has to do with the value that you place on yourself. If nobody else values you, then it's difficult to value yourself. Our third reason for interpersonal relationship is stimulation. Wow, have you ever had a time when there was nothing going on and you just felt like you were bored? Human beings need stimulation, just like sunflowers need sun. In fact, my neighbors next door have sunflowers in front of the house. And so you can watch the sunflowers turn as the sun moves because they need the stimulation of the sun. Human beings are the same way. We need stimulations. From infancy to death, we need stimulation emotionally, we need stimulation mentally, we need stimulation physically. The fourth reason that we need interpersonal relationships is for belonging. Again, because human beings are social animals. And we work in groups. That maximizes us. We want to feel that we belong somewhere. Where do we belong on the face of the planet? And the best place is to have people that you associate with, that you belong. Family gives us that first situation. Our interpersonal relationships outside the family, at work, we need to feel like we belong. I work at a university where we have 35,000 students. We probably have 2,000 faculty and maybe 1,000 administrators. It's pretty easy to get lost in that big number. So I want to belong somewhere on campus. So I belong in my department. My people that are in my department, I feel like I belong there. And I belong with my students, so I have belonging. Lastly, we have interpersonal relationships because they maximize our pleasures and minimize our pains. Wow. Maximize pleasures and minimize pain. Whenever something good happens to us, we have at least 1 or 2 people that we can go and tell. Or hopefully you do have that. Let's say you won the lottery and you won $1 million. Who would you go tell? And the reason we tell is because it maximizes the pleasure. Every time you tell someone that you won $1 million, you get to have the happiness all over again. So we maximize pleasure. We minimize pain in that when something happens to us that hurts us or makes us feel down, when we share that pain with someone else, it lessens the pain. every time you tell the story. I always say that my husband, the man that I was married to, was my best friend because I had a lot of childhood trauma. He spent many hours listening to me, and it reduced the pain. So we so far have talked about 5 then reasons that we have interpersonal relationships: to alleviate loneliness, to increase our self-esteem, to stimulate us, to give us a sense of belonging, and lastly, to maximize pleasures and minimize pains. All right, now, we've covered 2 points in this lecture. One was definitions of interpersonal communication and relationships, and number 2, we talked about the reasons that we have interpersonal relationships. People tend to discount them and think that they're not important, but they are very important. So let's go on to point 3, and that is, what should we look for in an interpersonal relationship? We have many opportunities over a day's time, over a time of a week, to establish relationships. And we have to make decisions about what we're looking for in them. Even within our families, we need to know what we need to look for in order to have a good relationship. So let's talk about point 3, the things that we should look for in a relationship. The first one, very important, mutual desire for a connection. The people who are involved in a relationship, be it 1, 2, or 3, or 4, should want to be connected. If they don't want to be connected, then that presents a problem. Even in a family where people are sisters, brothers, cousins, even with parents, there are times when 1 or 2 of the people in the relationship don't want to be there. Let's say, for example, when kids get to the tweens, they're pre-teens. Often they don't want to be involved with their parents. They don't want to talk to their parents. They just want to do what they want to do. And thank God they grow out of this, but that is a tough time for parents. So there needs to be a mutual desire for connection. Otherwise, the relationship doesn't work well. Secondly, there needs to be a mutual respect. I cannot emphasize this enough. Mutual respect. Respect means that you understand that the other person has rights to their own ideas, their own feelings, the way they do things, and that we need to look at those things as valid. You disrespect people when you talk to them in a way that says that how they are is invalid. Mutual respect. You can't have that if you don't respect yourself. You start with your respect for yourself and then respect for others. And how do you get it? You teach people how they need to respect you. For example, you teach people how you want to be talked to, how you want to be treated by giving them feedback. But we need mutual respect for everybody involved. Thirdly, we need mutual access to communication. If you're going to be in an interpersonal relationship, everybody needs to have access to communicate with each other. In other words, everybody must have a way to contact the other person, to be involved with the other person. So you need mutual access. Sometimes in families, for example, children may have different access to their mothers as opposed to their fathers. Very often they end up not having a lot of access to dad because he's at work. When he comes home, he's tired. He may have his mind on other things, where they have more access to mothers. And don't let me be sexist, because there's certainly families where the child may have more access to dad than the mom, but hopefully they have access to both. So you need to have mutual access. Lastly, there needs to be a shared understanding of what kind of relationship you're in. Everybody in the relationship needs to understand what kind of relationship is this. I use this example from my parents. Both of them have passed away, so I won't be embarrassing them. But when I turned 18, before I was 18, my parents always treated me like I was a child. I was a child in a relationship. Then, for some miraculous reason, they decided when I was 18 that I would be their best friend. Each one of them wanted me to be their best friend. And they would talk to me about things that were inappropriate, things from their relationships that I should not be involved with. And so, me, the child, it took me time to teach my parents what was appropriate and what was inappropriate for our relationship. And I kept saying to them, yes, I'm 18, but I'm still your child. That's my dad, that's my mom. And so there's certain conversations that we shouldn't have. They didn't like that very much, but it made me feel more comfortable. So you need a shared understanding of what kind of relationship is. When I walk into my classroom, I make sure that my students understand what the nature of our relationship is. And that is that I'm the teacher and they're the students. And while I may treat them in a friendly way and talk to them in a friendly manner, we're not friends and we're not there to be friends. We're there to teach and learn together. So I establish what kind of relationship we have, and if they can't follow that, then we got a problem in class. So let's go on then to wrap up this lecture on interpersonal communication, and we'll conclude by saying that our session today has focused on interpersonal communication and relationships. Now, we covered 3 points: interpersonal communication and interpersonal relationships as they are defined differently. Number 2, we understand that we have interpersonal relationships for many reasons, and it varies. Number 3, we talked about the fact that there are several characteristics that we should use to create effective relationships. Now, as I sum up everything, I want to say that my hope is that you become aware of your own interpersonal relationships and begin to understand them so that what? You can maximize your pleasure, so that you can have a good, effective life. I invite you to join me for other talks, and if you want to learn more about interpersonal relationships, see the bottom of this video for a PowerPoint. And I will leave you with the saying from one of my favorite people. That's Mr. Spock from Star Trek, and he says, "Live long and prosper."